Alright, finally, an ATX mid-tower case worth talking about. This is Lian's new O11 Dynamic Mini, and it's not that mini, right? It's not the smallest of cases, even by mid-tower standards, but I think once you see how much hardware you can actually fit in here, a lot of you are going to be very surprised. Lian have taken the design elements from the original O11 Dynamic, which has been insanely popular, then made it 20% smaller in volume, but then still kept a decent chunk of that epic radiator compatibility. So let's go through what you need to know about the new O11 Mini and how I'd recommend building in this case, because you do have quite a lot of options. Firstly, how mini actually is the new O11 Dynamic Mini? Well, in the context of a mid-tower case, the physical volume isn't actually that small at all. In fact, it's slightly larger than an NZXT H510 Elite, although it can fit significantly more hardware inside, which is what makes this case so interesting in my opinion. The footprint of the O11 Mini is also quite large, even in the context of a mid-tower, so just keep that in mind. Most of the space savings here compared to the regular O11 are in the vertical height of the case, not so much the width and the length. And then for some additional context, here's the N-Case M1, which is housing my own ITX system with two 240mm radiators in a custom loop, just to give you an idea of the total volume and footprint of something that is actually mini. Now, I've always been a big fan of the original O11 Dynamic when it comes to design, and I feel like the steel, aluminium, and tempered glass aesthetic just works really well. The O11 Mini is no different, although I will say that I'm not a fan of the acrylic that makes up part of the top of the case. It does make it look a little bit cheap. The case is separated into two main compartments. You've got your primary system components and cooling located in the main chamber, and then the less visually desirable components such as your power supply and drives hiding behind the motherboard tray. Back here you can mount up to two 2.5-inch drives with the removable bracket, then another two 3.5-inch drives just underneath the power supply. And that's one of the main things worth mentioning here. Only SFX and SFX-L power supplies are supported. Personally, I don't feel like this is too much of a drawback, as even if you are throwing a high-end ATX system like this in here, you have plenty of high-power SFX and SFX-L units available to you. But here's where this case gets really interesting. The O11 Mini has modular motherboard and expansion slot panels, which will allow you to switch between ATX, micro ATX, and ITX boards. This means that the O11 Mini is both a space-optimized ATX mid-tower and a generously sized ITX case with absolutely huge radiator clearances. Swapping between the different motherboard panels is quite easy as well. That's just done by rearranging the sections of the rear panel. As you can imagine, which motherboard form factor you end up going with directly affects radiator and fan clearances. The largest radiator compatibility is achieved with an ITX board in the middle position. There you can install up to a 360mm radiator at the top and the bottom, as well as up to a 240 or 280mm at the side. With a micro ATX board in the middle position, a 280mm radiator at the bottom is no longer possible, but a 360 still is, and the clearance there will depend on how many PCIe devices you have installed. Then with ATX, you can no longer install top-mounted radiators, but you do gain a bit of clearance for your side-mounted radiator and fans as a result, and again, clearance for that bottom-mounted radiator will depend on how many PCIe devices you have installed. So the big thing to note here is that a top-mounted radiator will not fit along with an ATX board, and that seems like Lian's main differentiation of the regular O11 and this O11 Mini. To be honest though, I would have liked to have seen that 360mm AIO support at the top here, seeing as one does physically fit here even with a bit of wiggle room available, but I guess they didn't want to blur the line too much between this and the bigger O11 variant. So with all of the different motherboard options and possibilities building in the O11 Mini, I see two options that make the most sense. Firstly, just an overkill ITX system with two 360mm radiators in a custom loop. I think that would be an epic use of space in this case. And secondly would be a bit more of a reserved ATX mid-tower system with, say, up to a 240 or 280mm AIO mounted on the side, where perhaps you could use the rest of the mounting options just for case fans and additional airflow for your system. This build here is a bit of an idea of what I think most users will be looking to build in this case. So here we've got the MSI B550 gaming carbon motherboard with a Ryzen 5600 XT, and that's cooled by the NZXT Kraken Z63 280mm AIO, and that's pulling fresh air from the side of the case. Then there's three 120mm fans pulling air up towards the graphics card, which is the new MSI RTX 3080 Supreme X, which also launches today, and then we've got another 3 120mm fans pulling air out of the case and through the top panel. And I had no problems building this system in the O11 Mini at all, as a mid-tower case should be. It's pretty roomy and cable management was quite a breeze. I think the biggest hurdle that most people are going to have building in this case is just simply deciding what they build, what motherboard they go with, and what cooling options they go with as well, because there are so many options available. One thing I did notice though regarding the SFX power supply was that the PCIe cables from the Corsair SF600 were only just long enough to reach the GPU, so it doesn't really leave you with many options for properly managing them. Basically, they have to stretch over the top of the graphics card and then point directly to the power supply. It's not really a complaint, but just something to keep in mind. Lian also includes a few different pump mounting brackets that will be super handy for custom loops. Ideally, you'll be installing these towards the bottom and front of the case, either mounted to a radiator or fan, or just to the case itself. Now, one thing I've always liked about the O11's design are those bottom intake fans that pull air directly up towards the GPU. In a regular mid-tower case, this area is usually completely blocked by a power supply, and GPU thermals usually suffer quite a bit. And here we can see just how important those fans are. Our RTX 3080 drops 12 degrees just by running those 3 bottom intake fans at just 900 RPM. That is an absolutely huge difference. So if you're building in this case, definitely populate that bottom area with some fans. We can also see that the O11 Mini is relatively well ventilated. By removing the top panel, our GPU thermals only improve by around 2 degrees. I'll also note that this new RTX 3080 flagship from MSI can pull upwards of 370 watts and boost to 2000 megahertz consistently, so that's why thermals here look a little bit warmer compared to some of the other 3080s out there. Alright, so wrapping up the O11 Mini, firstly, it's not that mini. I mean, even by mid-tower case standards, it's still around 40 liters plus, and the footprint as well, especially, it's not going to save you that much space on your desk compared to, say, an actual ITX case. However, if you were considering the regular sized O11 Dynamic, which has a lot more kind of height and clearance for that top mounted radiator, but you can't really justify that much radiator volume in your case, then this is definitely something to consider, especially if you're planning on building something a little bit more modest. And then on the completely other end of the spectrum, I think this case does make sense for ITX systems. And I know I said it's quite big, even by ATX standards, but if you are populating it with enough radiator volume, let's say 360 at the top and the bottom, and maybe a 240 or 280 at the side, that is an absolutely monstrous amount of cooling. And the lines are kind of being blurred these days with ITX and ATX. The fact that you can slot, insane amount of graphics power in an ITX system, along with a 16-core CPU and 64 gigs of RAM, I can see why a lot of people might opt for an ITX board in this case. Retail price is said to be around 100 USD, which I think is more than fair considering what you're getting, and I will leave all of the links down below so you can check pricing and availability in your region. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.